Hi, good morning and welcome to this session. I hope the presentation is visible. Today, we are going to talk about deal structuring and how a target is selected. Now, typically for an investment banker, the most important part, is with respect to the most important part is with respect to, or the most one of the most important things that an investment banker does, and one of the most important part in investment banking and investment finance is a deal. A deal is a transaction, which can be related to acquisition. It can be related to investment. It can be related to two companies coming together, or it can be related to two companies jointly forming another third company. And a deal is basically one of the more important, finalizing, structuring, and creating a deal is one of the most important part of investment finance and one of the most important functions that an investment banker takes place. Investment banker does. And related to that, a more important aspect or more important part is how a deal is structured. And an extension of how a deal is structured is the fact that how you select a target. And in today's session, we are kind of going to look at that. So what is a target though? I mean, when we say target selection, we need to understand what is a target. So when a company acquires another company, or when a company invests in another company, or when a company decides to jointly go ahead with another company, uh, the company which is being acquired, or the company in whom another company is investing, or the company who is getting merged into another company is known as a target. The target is the target company, a company who I want to acquire or who I want to merge with. It is an attractive merger or acquisition option, and but to a potential acquirer. So if there's a company who wants to acquire another company, it is known as an acquirer. And an attractive sort of company is the or an attractive option to acquire is known as the target. And there are various reasons why companies are considered to be uh, seen as attractive options. They're seen as possible targets for different reasons. It could be for new markets, new products, increasing profitability, increase in revenue streams, better economic feasibility, increasing the value of stakeholders. There are a lot of options. There are a lot of reasons rather why a company would look to acquire another company, and hence there are a lot of reasons why a target is considered to be attractive, and that the fact that the target sort of fulfills your requirement becomes very important, and in that respect a target selection also becomes very important. So before selecting a target, what is to be considered? Before selecting a target, the following things should be considered. Market conditions. Obviously, the market conditions should be conducive, to an acquisition. If when I say conducive to an acquisition, it should mean that when I'm acquiring a company, the market conditions should increase my revenues, my profitability, my profile, uh, you know, on the basis of that acquisition. If I acquire a company and it leads to an economic downturn in my company and the acquired company due to market conditions, if I acquire a company and it basically stops my profitability, if I acquire a company and it increases my liabilities, that's not going to help my company, and hence that means the acquisition hasn't worked, and hence it is very important to understand and evaluate the market conditions. Let's say just about 20 years, 18, 19 years back in 2008, 2009, 2010, when there was a huge downscale recession going on. Market conditions then weren't conducive for acquisition, or were they conducive? Maybe in some aspects they were, because some companies were not doing well. You acquired them at a lower value, but typically the market was not in a good space, and if you acquired a company, it was only going to increase your responsibilities and liabilities. It may not have led to your to your profitability increasing, revenues increasing, or value to your stakeholder increasing. So all that needs to be evaluated before selecting a target. Let's say your target is in the consumer consumption space, and if due to market factors the spending capacity of the consumers is less, consumers are no longer spending a lot, then the market conditions are not conducive to acquire that company, because once you acquire that company, it is not going to lead to increasing your profitability or revenue. It's not going to help your company. Let's say you are in the tourism industry and you want to acquire a hospitality company or a company in a hotel industry, but for some reason tourism is badly affected due to, like, say, COVID-like conditions or other conditions, then market conditions are not conducive for acquisition. So we need to consider the market conditions before going forward for acquisitions. The economic capabilities. Now, any sort of acquisition, the primary purpose behind that acquisition is to ensure that the value of the company increases, the revenues of the company increases, there's the profitability of the company increases, the value of the stakeholder increases. Now, does the what needs to be considered before acquiring is, does this company which is going to be acquired have the capabilities of doing that? Are your economics going to improve based on the acquisitions? If the economics is not going to improve based on the acquisition, then that acquisition does not make sense, and it therefore makes uh, great sense to to sort of evaluate the target to ensure that your economic capabilities are addressed. Now, if the target has a lot of liabilities, a lot of debts, a lot of loans, or a lot of losses, a lot of payments, if you're going to acquire it and all your money is going to go down in settling those, then the economic capabilities are not there, and that acquisition does not make sense. Hence, it's very important, very important to consider the economic capabilities and to address the economic capabilities to ensure that your economic values are going to increase post acquisition with respect to a target. Another factor that needs to be considered while uh, before acquiring, rather, and before selecting a target, is the impact that it's going to have a competitor on the competitors. Competitors are people who are in the same line of business in which you are conducting your business. That's competition, right? So you need to ensure that acquisition puts you one step ahead of the competition of the competition. If your acquisition is not going to actually get you ahead of the competition, that acquisition does not does not make sense. The other thing that you need to also consider is from a regulatory perspective. What is called as the antitrust regulation in India, it is called as the Indian Competition Act. Now, an Indian Competition Act basically has provisions that prevents you from making acquisitions that will have an adverse impact on the market. So if you make an acquisition that is going to actually create a monopoly of yours in the market, the Indian Competition Act does not prevent that. There will be regulatory action. If you're going to create a competition that will acquisition that will give you an unfair advantage over a competition, let's say there is a particular raw material that is manufactured only by one entity, and you acquire that entity, and by virtue of which that raw material is only be accessible to you and not your competition, it's an adverse impact on the market. So you also need to ensure that you are in compliance with the Antitrust Indian Competition Act and its provisions. You're not creating an adverse effect and not having an adverse impact on the market. And that is another thing to consider before selecting a target. Now, what happens when you want to acquire a company, or when you want to, when you sort of decide, or what happens, how does the acquisition process actually work? Now, the first thing is that the board of a company, the board of directors of the company, and the important people in the company, like the executives of the company, they will have to decide, whether an acquisition is required, and why that acquisition is required, and how to sort of conduct that acquisition. Now, if an acquisition is required because if the company is doing well but it can do better with an acquisition, then the board and the executives will take a call and say that, look, we're doing well, but we need to sort of if we acquire a company, it is going to help us better, so we need to acquire another company, and that's the part to take. Then the board will say, let's start looking around for a company, let's see if we can acquire something. But what is how is that acquisition? Acquisition generally can be for two reasons. One is to enhance your existing business, expand it, grow it, create more revenue, get into a different sort of strategy with respect to a similar line of business, or get into a completely new business. So I'm manufacturing soft drinks, but I want to get into the food industry. So I'll acquire a food company. So I'm doing soft drink plus food. It helps my business. Or I'm doing manufacturing soft drinks. I'm acquiring another soft drink company. It just increases my capacity, my capability, and increases my revenue. Or, as we see in the example in the slide, and if there's an automobile manufacturing company, you will look and see that, look, the trend is leaning towards electric vehicles today. So do we start from scratch and start creating electric vehicles, producing electric vehicles? Or do we sort of continue and make our combustible engines, or we make a new acquire a company which is already producing manufacturing electric vehicles and enhance our business? That is a call that the board and the executives will take, and that will be the strategy that will be with respect to the acquisition. Now, sometimes not all strategies are achievable due to the company's current state. What happens is sometimes you may want to achieve it, but there may be gaps. You may not have the revenue. There may not be company easily available. A company may be available that there'll be certain issues around it. So your corporate development team, will work with your business leaders to identify where our company stands, what are the existing capabilities, and are there any gaps with respect to the acquisition. Now, if there are gaps, identifying those gaps becomes very important. And identification of gaps will give everyone a very clear view of the investment that is required to achieve this corporate strategy. Once you have identified the gaps, once you have identified the gaps, you will then lead to a buy, build, or partner analysis. I mean, who are you going to buy, or who are you going to partner with, or you're going to build something, to rectify those gaps. To obtain the capabilities needed, you must assess whether it is better to build the capability of scratch. So whether it is better to build, say, in the example that we gave, electronic vehicle manufacturing unity, or partner with someone who is doing who is already in the electronic vehicle business, or acquire a company that is in the electronic vehicle business. Now, so that is it. You sort of identify those gaps, and once you identify the gap with respect to the company, you take steps to rectify the gap. And as I said, there are three ways. You can either partner with someone, you can build something from scratch yourself, or buy something. And more often than not, this analysis will result in acquisition. More often than not, you will then say, it might be better to acquire and get in the market straight away, and hence this leads to analysis to an acquisition. Obviously, reasons around it, because building something from scratch, that's going to take a lot of time. That's going to need a lot of expertise. It will take years and years before you build something, develop it, and enter the market and create a niche for yourself in the market. Partnerships can be messy. It's better to acquire something. If you have the capacity, if you have the investment, you have the amounts, it's always better to acquire. And you see so many acquisitions on this reason. People want to get into the market straight away. You acquire a company that's already in the business. You have the market, you have the customers, you have the manufacturing setup, you have the expertise. You acquire the company and straight away move into the market. And hence, one of the reasons is that's how the acquisition takes place. Now, once you decide that you want to acquire, you obviously need to identify the target company. We've already seen what the target is. You want to acquire the target, but you want to identify who a potential target company is. And here's one of the more important roles that the investment bankers do, because what the investment bankers do is they sort of combine, they are sort of very often companies approach investment bankers or people in investment finance and say, look, hang on, this is what we've done, an analysis that we've done. These are the gaps in our company. And because these are the gaps in the company, we want to acquire another company. And once we want to acquire a company, can you help us acquire a company like this? And hence The investment banker will then say, what is the criteria? What are the kind of company you're looking at? You have a criteria for selection of a target. Sometimes the criteria can be size of the company. If the size of the company is So if the size of the company may be a criteria for selection of the target. Uh, Sometimes whether the company is profitable or not could be a criteria in acquisition purposes. Uh, whether a company is profit making, and if it's profit making, obviously acquisition makes more sense. That may be a criteria for acquisition of the company. Your geography or where the company is located can also be an important criteria for selection, finalization, and selection of a target. Let's say I'm doing a particular business in Maharashtra. I want to expand that business in Bengal, and there's a company doing a similar business in Bengal. It might make sense to acquire that company. So geography can also be uh, can be a criteria for selection of the target. Type of the product, as I said, sometimes, so acquisitions can take place on the basis of three factors, right? You can want to acquire a company to get into a new business. You want to acquire a company to enhance your existing business, or you want to acquire a company, to sort of add another line to your existing business, not a completely different business. And that will determine that maybe so that acquisition may be determined by the type of the product that you're looking at, and hence type. So if you're into, maybe you are a soft drink manufacturer, you want to acquire a company who has cold storage facilities, or storing facilities, or bottling facilities. So that type of product will determine acquisition. You may be a mobile company, you are looking into someone getting into broadband internet services. So the type of product then becomes a criteria for acquisition. So the type of product then is also an important criteria for acquisition purposes. And culture is another important sort of factor, reason for the purpose of acquisition. You may have two companies having similar cultures, and you may decide that I want to merge or acquire this company. So culture also becomes an important criteria. So in terms of investment banking, a company may approach you and say, look, on all these criteria, we want to acquire a company. Lay down the criteria for acquisitions, and then you start looking for a target based on the acquisition criteria. So then once the criteria is sort of identified, you then start looking for a target. You start looking for an acquisition. Now, how do you select a target? You obviously need to know the company. You need to know how your target is, where your target is based, what is the basic fundamental business of your target, what are the number of employees, revenues, are there any liabilities. So you need to know your company that you're acquiring. You need to have a wish list that if I'm acquiring a certain company, that company should tick the following boxes, and only then I will acquire that company. So that wish list becomes very important. For instance, it should be based in a particular geography or location. It should be based in a particular you know it should be manufacturing a particular product. It should have a particular profitability. It should have a particular culture. All of these should be on your wish list. Number of employees, the kind of employees, that could be on your wish list, and the target company should also sort of match up to that wish list. You need to understand why a seller wants to sell a company as well. What is the motivation behind the sellers in selling the company? And what is the motivation for the sellers in selling the company? Are the sellers selling the company because they want to tie up with a bigger company, and they want a bigger company sort of take care of them? Are the sellers selling it because they are no longer interested in running the business? Or are there some other factors? Is there something that the sellers are hiding from you? Maybe there is some case against the company, and the sellers don't want to be interested in, involved in that. Maybe the company is making so many losses that the seller are no longer confident of taking it forward. Maybe the product is not allowed legally to be manufactured in the company. Maybe there are some hidden liabilities. What is the seller motivation is something very important to understand when you're selecting a target or a company for acquisition. There may be sellers who are just looking, to have a bigger partner who will take care of other things, and they can just purely concentrate on business or innovation related to that business. That is a good company to acquire. That will also mean that the sellers will remain with you in the post acquisition. But it's very important to understand and confirm that the sellers are not hiding anything. They're not trying to, do away with certain liabilities, certain court cases. So seller motivation becomes a very, very important factor when it comes to selecting a target. What you also need to do is have a group of advisors around you when you are thinking of acquisition. So you need to have a legal advisors and your tax advisors to do your and your financial advisors to do your legal due diligence to ensure that the company is legally in a good place, financial due diligence to ensure all finances are proper, no hidden liabilities, no hidden payments, tax due diligence to ensure tax compliances, no tax uh, liabilities. If the company is intellectual property heavy, technology based, people to identify that the technology is proper, functioning properly, who owns the technology, your investment advisors to structure the transaction properly. So if you're an acquiring entity, having a proper and a good group of advisors, it becomes very important, because your acquisition is going to be based on inputs generated by these advisors or input generation. So your legal advisors will tell you, will guide you as to the legality of the entire transaction, acquisition transaction. They will conduct a legal due diligence, tell you that the company is legally compliant in a proper place, validly incorporated or registered. The shareholding pattern is valid. There are no hidden elements around it. So all of that will be very important from a target perspective. So, these are another, few important criterias, in terms of determining how to select a target. Mhm. Once sorry, once a target is sort of identified, the next step is to move towards structuring of the deal. How the deal is going to be structured, how the deal is going to be, how are you going to acquire? What is deal structuring? So, what is a deal? The first step obviously is that a deal is a process by virtue of which a it's a transaction by virtue of which a company is acquired or merged. Deal is a very common the word used in common parlance. A deal, deal has been done or whatever. It's basically a transaction of acquiring another entity, or a transaction by virtue of which one entity merges with another entity. And once you have identified the target, once you have identified the criteria and sort of shortlisted the target, the next step obviously, is to ensure that the deal is structured in a manner that benefits the parties. So structuring of the transaction of acquisition or structuring of the transaction of merger is very important. And hence the deal structuring is very important. There are various ways in which deals are structured, or various manners in which acquisition take place. Sometimes, if you look at the third bullet point, it talks about stock acquisition. This is the most common way of acquisition. There are two companies with two sets of shareholders. One company acquires the shares from the shareholders, or the stocks from the shares from the shareholders of the another company, and by acquiring the stock, it becomes the owner of that company. This is the most straightforward and common manner in which a deal is structured. Stock acquisition, share acquisition, the same word. In the United States, it's called as stock acquisition. In India, it is called as share acquisition. You acquire shares from shareholders of the company, and it becomes a share acquisition. By acquiring the shares, you acquire the company, and you acquire all aspects of the company. So when you acquire all aspects, you own its assets, liabilities, whatever is, its indebtedness, its cases, everything into it. Sometimes you may not want to acquire everything. You only want to acquire certain important assets connected with the company. So let's say a company is technology, has owns certain, some technology, and you want to acquire that technology. Why acquire the entire company then? Why acquire all the shares of the company then? So you may go ahead and acquire the assets of the company. Only, you may identify certain assets like technology, or there may be some IPR or intellectual property, or it may be some factory immovable property. And rather than acquiring the entire company, you may go ahead and only acquire the assets of those identified assets. The difference between a share acquisition and asset acquisition is that you acquire the assets from the company. The second company, you don't own the company, you don't acquire the company, you only acquire certain assets. Excuse me. An extension of the asset acquisition is something called as a slum sale in India, or a business acquisition. A business acquisition is when you acquire all the assets and liabilities of the company, but you don't sort of acquire the company itself, and you don't identify and acquire only particular assets. You acquire every asset connected to the business. So, there's only one value for all the assets that are acquired. It's called a slum sale or a business acquisition, not particular assets. And you acquire that, those assets as well. So there is stock acquisition that we've seen, there's business acquisition that we've seen, and there's asset acquisition we've seen. Another way of acquiring a company is by merging or amalgamating with that company. A merger is a process when two companies come together. One company gets absorbed into that company. So I acquire another company. All aspects of that company gets absorbed into the bigger company. So let's say there's a company called ABC and there's a company called XYZ. When ABC acquires XYZ, XYZ ceases to exist, and everything with respect to XYZ is absorbed and acquired by ABC. Amalgamation is a process where XYZ and ABC come together, and everything is combined, and a third entity called CDE is created. Uh, what happens then is you have two entities, and they combine together, and that's a third entity. So difference between merger and amalgamation is: merger is when one bigger entity absorbs and acquires a smaller entity into it. Amalgamation is when two entities come together and a third entity of a combination is created. LBO, what is an LBO? LBO is what is called as a leveraged buyout. So in this case, what happens is you avail a debt, a loan, and use that loan to buy that company, and that leverage that loan. The lender who was given that loan will leverage to take the receivable. So basically, a LBO is a leverage buyout. We'll see that in detail as we move forward in this session. And then we also have something called as a joint venture, where two companies come together and for business purposes, for specific reason, come together and create a third venture, a joint venture, where their responsibility is divided between two companies. And typically it's a new company, but which is a combination of two companies for specific business reasons. So these are the ways, asset acquisition, business acquisition, stock acquisition, merger, amalgamation, LBO, and joint venture, ways when companies combine together, and that helps in and that's how deals are typically structured with respect to mergers and acquisition. We'll look at all of these aspects in detail, but before that, we'll just take a 15-minute break and then we'll come back. Thank you. Hello, so welcome back, and we start again. So we were talking about various aspects about deal structuring, if you remember, and we spoke about asset acquisition, business acquisition, stock acquisition, mergers, LBOs, and joint ventures. So asset acquisition, as I mentioned, is acquisitions where you sort of acquire certain specific assets. And do not acquire the entire company or the entire business. Now, there are certain advantages of an asset acquisition. The most obvious advantage being that you can decide which assets to buy from and which not to. So you don't take the assets that don't have value, you don't take the liabilities, you don't take the bad parts of a company, so as to speak, and you sort of acquire the assets that you can benefit from it, or you may enhance, which may enhance your business. The other sort of advantage is that the selling company continues as a corporate entity. So let's say there's an X company ABC and an XYZ. In a corporate acquisition, ABC acquires all the shares, so XYZ uses characteristics and ABC becomes the owner. But in an asset acquisition, ABC will acquire only certain assets from XYZ. And because it will acquire only certain assets from XYZ, uh, the corporate characteristic of XYZ and the corporate existence of XYZ will continue. Now, the disadvantage of an asset acquisition, includes that you may not be able to acquire non-transferable assets. For example, goodwill, which goodwill of a company is something that cannot be transferred unless you acquire that entire company. So these non-transferable assets like a goodwill cannot be acquired. uh, an asset acquisition may also lead to a high impact tax cost for both the seller and the buyer, because each asset will be taxed separately, unlike say a business acquisition, which is tax effective, or a share acquisition. And it may also take more time because you're acquiring each asset separately. So compared to other deal structures, this will also take some time. In a acquisition, so the advantage of a stock purchase acquisition is, your taxes on a stock purchase deal are minimized, especially for the seller. So what happens is, on a stock purchase, there is a capital gain tax on the amount that the seller gets. It may be a long term capital gain or a short term capital gain. The taxes are minimized, and if particularly if the stocks are held for a period of more than a particular period of time specified, 3 years, 1 year or 3 year, it is called as a long term capital, and the tax rates for long term is lesser. But in any case, even if it's a short term capital gain or a long term capital gain, the taxes on a stock purchase deal are minimized. Closing a stock purchase deal is less time consuming. You acquire the shares, your board approves it, and it sort of is completed. Negotiations are less complicated because you're sort of negotiating only for purchase of the shares, and it also sometimes may be less expensive. A disadvantage is that obviously, a legal and financial liabilities may accompany a stock purchase acquisition. So, to give an example again, let's say there's a company XYZ Private Limited and an ABC Private Limited. If XYZ acquires all the shares of ABC, then all the liabilities are also acquired by ABC Private Limited. Sorry, by XYZ. So you will acquire, when you acquire the entire company through shares, the legal and financial liabilities may also accompany. And sometimes what happens is, a company may have different shareholders. So it may not be completely held by one or two people. It may be held by different people. And if you want to acquire the company, you will have to buy shares from all the shareholders. And there may be some shareholders who may not want to sell. So these are minority shareholders. And sometimes these uncooperative minority shareholders can turn into a problem, because then you may not be able to acquire the entire company. Sorry. Just a minute. Sorry. Okay. Merger or a hive off, merger, demerger, hive off is another way of restructuring your I'm sorry, I'm facing some technical issues. Just give me a minute, please. Yeah, sorry. So, uh, yeah, merger, demerger, or high off is another way of acquisition. Although the term merger is uncommon, it's very interchangeably and commonly used in acquisition. Merger is a different process. Acquisition is when you acquire a share of the company, and you typically acquire it through contractual documents. Typically, a merger is when two entities come together to form a new entity, or one entity absorbs another entity in it. So there's one entity that is formed. And in India, the merger is typically done through a court approved process. Now, a merger is typically less complicated because all liabilities, assets become of that entity which is created by the merger of two entities. So it's a less complicated process. Of course, in India, it is a very long, time-consuming process, and it requires a lot of approvals. So you need the approvals of the board, then you need the approvals of all the shareholders. You need, if there are debts and creditors of a company, you need approvals of all the creditors, and then you approach the court or the tribunal in India's case, which is the National Company Law Tribunal. It's called the NCLT, and then you sort of acquire the NCLT's approval after the NCLT checks everything. So in India, a merger typically, or a demerger for that matter, same process is done. Demerger is when a company is sort of, when there's a bigger company is actually split into two companies, or hive off is when a part of the company is hived off to form a new entity. So in a demerger is, say there's a big company, but they, they're involved in three or four lines of business, and they want to sort of make sure, concentrate on one line of business. So they will sort of demerge, and the three or four lines of business will be demerged into three or four companies. Hive off is when one part of the company is then taken off, hived off, and a new company is formed to look after that part of the company. In both cases, again, in India, it is through a court-driven process, and when it is done through a court-driven process, the process that I spoke about, approvals from everyone concerned and all of that takes a long time. In structuring a deal, though, we need to sort of, well, if you're investment bankers involved in investment finance, helping companies in acquiring or selling off, while structuring a deal, the advantage and disadvantage must be considered, along with other influencing factors, to reach a conclusion as to which is the best way to structure and which is the best possible way to for an acquisition or a merger to go ahead. Now, what is a leverage buyout? We briefly touched upon it, while speaking about. So, an LBO, or a leverage buyout, is, when the buyer uses a significant amount of debt to finance the purchase of the target company. So, what happens is, let's say I want to acquire a company, but I don't have the money. I don't have the money to buy that company out. So, what will I do is, I'll go to some lenders, and I will sort of seek a loan to sort of build or generate that capacity, or generate the money to buy the company. So the buyer borrows money to pay for the purchase price, but obviously a lender will say, use the, I want to guarantee that the money that I'm lending is going to be repaid back. Now, typically, a loan, how will you repay that loan? So what will you do is, you will show the lender the target company's revenue stream, the money that the target company is generating. And you will say that I guarantee you that I will repay this loan by using the target company's cash flow. So in this type of deal structure, the borrower borrows money to pay the consideration of the purchase price for acquiring the company, and the debt is repaid using the target company's cash flow. So the target company's assets are used as collateral, as a security for a debt. So if the debt is not repaid, the lender can actually take control of these assets of the target company. Also, because I have shared the estimated cash flow of the target company, there is a little bit of a guarantee or a comfort for the lender that my loan is going to be paid from the target company's cash flow. So leverage buyout is very, very popular in the United States and in the European countries. Where you borrow money, you sort of say that your money that is borrowed is going to be repaid through the cash flows of the target company. For all football fans, for instance, when Manchester United was acquired by the Glazer Group, it was a leveraged buyout. And until today, revenues from Manchester United are paid to, are used to repay that money. Advantages, so, a leveraged buyout can allow buyers to acquire companies. If you cannot afford a company, you can buy those companies with the help of a loan. So that allows obviously the company to acquire it. The target company's cash flow is used to repay the debt, allowing the buyer to potentially generate a high return. So, you have cash flows, you repay the debt, and then there's a high return on their investment. Disadvantage, obviously, they can be anytime you borrow money, anytime you sort of, are availing a debt, there's a risk because you're liable to pay that debt, and for some reason you're not unable to pay that debt, there'll be consequences. And that can also lead, the fact that your cash flows are used to repay the debt will mean that they are not used for other purposes, and that can lead to a economic downturn of the target company, and obviously there'll be a financial burden for the target company and its employees. So another way in which an acquisition takes place, or an acquisition can be structured, or a combination can be structured, is joint venture. Now, what are the joint ventures? Basically, when two or more companies collaborate to form a new business entity. In this kind of a structure, the parties contribute assets or resources to the joint venture, and it is typically operated as separate business entities. Now, very often joint ventures are sort of formed for a limited time for the business purpose. So let's say there is a company that is manufacturing certain products, and there is a company that is sort of good in distribution of those products. So the two companies might come together in, for a short period and say, let's form a third company. So that company will take the manufacturing products and will also use the distribution network, and revenues will be then split between the two companies. So the joint venture is formed. Or let's say there's a company that is manufacturing a particular product, but that particular product the value of that product can be enhanced by using a particular technology. So, and one company has that technology. So what you do is, the two companies come together. One says that you bring the technology, I'll bring the manufacturing expertise, and when I do all of that, when I bring the manufacturing expertise and when I bring the technology, we'll form a third company which will use all these two aspects, and we'll then have an enhanced product. Now, that's what basically a joint venture company is. A joint venture company is joint venture companies form for a limited period of time with a business objective, when two companies combine their expertise or resources to sort of create a business goal. The advantage of a joint venture company is that it allows companies to combine resources and expertise to achieve a common objective. We've seen how that happens, and it can result in cost saving and synergies. The disadvantage obviously requires careful planning and coordination between the parties. And it's very important that the parties are very clear as to what they are bringing to the joint venture company, and the parties are very clear as to their roles, responsibilities, because very often joint venture companies and their formation results in disputes over management and control of the joint venture. Now, what we've seen types of companies and types of how acquisition takes place. But another important aspect of structuring is how the structuring in terms of the payment of the price of acquisition happens, because this is also very important to part of a transaction or a deal. Structuring of consideration is the price that you pay for acquiring a company, and that can be done in various ways. A structuring of a consideration can be done through a cash payment. This is the most straightforward payment method, where you just pay cash and you get the company in return. It can be done through a stock payment. So let's say there are two companies, XYZ and ABC. XYZ wants to acquire the shares of ABC, but XYZ doesn't have the money. So what will you do? XYZ will say to the shareholders of ABC, you give me the shares of ABC, and in return, XYZ will allot shares of XYZ to the shareholders of ABC. So it will be a swapping of shares. So shareholders of ABC, rather than getting cash, will get shares of XYZ. And particularly if the buyer is a very high valued buyer, they can liquidate those shares and get a lot of money. And XYZ will then take control of ABC. So you may not have cash, but you offer your shares. The selling entity shareholders acquire those shares, and you get the shares of the selling entity. Another way of structuring consideration is through a debt payment. In this case, the buyer takes on debt. We've seen that leverage buyout to finance the purchase price, and the debt is repaid over the time. And earnout. Now, earnout is a way where you divide the purchase price into two parts. What you say to the existing founders, promoters, or shareholders of the selling company is that I will pay you half of the consideration today, but I want the company to reach a particular value. And if it company reaches a particular value, I will pay you half of the other value of the consideration. Once it reaches that value, and if it doesn't reach, I'll pay a lesser value. So let's say, to give you an example, XYZ wants to acquire a company ABC. Now I go to the founders. XYZ goes to the founders of ABC and says that look, 100 rupees is the consideration for payment of for buying ABC. I'm paying 50 rupees today. But if ABC, you ensure that ABC is made and acquiring part of your shares, but you'll stay connected with the company. And if ABC reaches a particular high value in terms of revenue over a period of 2 years, I will pay you 50 rupees. But if the balance 50, but if it doesn't reach that value, I will pay you only 25 rupees. There are two advantages to this. One is you ensure that the company keeps doing well and people who are connected with the company stay in the company. And secondly, the company doesn't do well, you end up saving money, you don't pay the entire amount. And earnout is a very popular methodology, particularly in acquisition of early stage startup companies where the founders and promoters are good in their business. The other way of consideration is seller financing, where the seller provides financing to the buyer. So sometimes the seller may want to get out the company, but the buyer may not have the money. So seller will say, I'll provide a loan to the buyer. The buyer repays the loan to the seller, and the seller gets the price plus the loan repayment. It's not very common, but it's a methodology that is used. Uh, we've already seen swapping of shares. That is also called as equity payment, where you pay equity in the target company. But when we discussed the swap structure or the swap payment structure, we actually looked at a structure where the buyer is paying, giving shares of his own company. Sometimes the buyer may say, look, to the seller, I'm buying the company out, but you stay in the company, you do well, and I will give you shares of your own company, more shares of your company. And that is an equity payment in the existing company. This payment method particularly is very popular, when the buyer wants to retain the seller's expertise. He's already involved in the company and he wants the seller to continue to be involved in the company. And obviously, a lot of these times, whether it's cash, leverage buyout, loan, swap shares, seller financing, buyer financing, sometimes you can have a combination of all of these, to acquire. So structuring of the manner in which an acquisition is taking place, and structuring of the manner in which in which a company pays the payment price, the purchase price, the consideration. That's one of the more important aspects of a part of investment finance. It's a very important aspect of investment banking, and that's how an important aspect if you're an investment banker or investment finance, in terms of your contribution to a transaction or a deal. The last bit for today is that some of the tax considerations. We'll be having a detailed session on tax, but one of the more important part is the tax consideration of the transaction. So as I said, typically when there is a transaction involving an acquisition, there's a capital gain tax involved. So whether you're selling assets or whether you're selling shares, whether you're selling assets or whether you're selling shares, uh, the seller receives an amount, and whatever amount the seller receives is taxed, and it is called as, because it's an capital asset that is sold, it is a capital gain tax. Capital gain tax is of two types. One is called as a short-term capital gain tax and a long-term capital gain tax. If you are holding an asset for a short period of time, and that is defined under law, then you're taxed higher if you sell it within that short period. If you are holding an asset for a long period of time, then you are taxed less. Now, for shares, the if you're holding it for more than 1 year, it will be considered as a long-term capital gain. If you sell it within 1 year, it is a short-term capital and taxed more. For assets, immovable assets, if you are holding it for more than less than 3 years, it is short term. If you sell it after 3 years, are you holding it for more than 3 years? It is called as a long term capital. So capital gain tax is a tax where anytime you sell an asset, whether it's shares or property, you're taxed. It's a type, it's a two types, short term and long term capital gain. A short term capital gain is if you're holding it in terms of shares for 1 year or less, or in terms of assets for 3 years or less. Long term is 1 year or more, or 3 years or more. Now, whenever an acquisition transaction takes place, it is very important to understand in which jurisdiction this transaction is taking place. If the entire transaction is taking place in India, obviously the taxation will be as per laws of India. But if the transaction is taking, if there are multiple jurisdictions involved, then you need to very carefully understand. If the seller is in India and the money is coming in India, then then what happens is that you will be taxed as per India. But sometimes, countries have, if the money is going out, then you will be taxed as per maybe taxed as per the jurisdiction in which the money is going. So if the seller is in the US, the taxation may be as per US laws because the law is coming to the US. Sorry, the money is coming into the US, United States. But sometimes what happens is countries have what is called as agreements. These agreements are called as double taxation avoidance agreements. You don't want to be taxed in two countries if the deal is happening across countries. And double taxation agreements typically provide that if two countries are involved, then the best tax rates of one country will be applicable, and the seller will not be taxed in the other country. So it is very important to understand the jurisdiction of the transaction and important to understand in which jurisdiction the transaction is happening and which jurisdiction the tax laws will be applicable for. And once the tax laws are applicable, you also need to understand and find out whether there is a double taxation treaty, whether that double taxation treaty is applicable, and what are the tax rates that is going to be applicable. So as I said, if you look at one of the earlier slides, I said if you're in an acquisition transaction and if you're acquiring, you need to understand who is the you need to have advisors around you, and tax advisors play a very important role because determining jurisdiction, determining where taxes are applicable, determining what taxes are applicable, the nature of the taxes, whether there's a double taxation avoidance treaty applicable, all of that is very important, and the deal needs to be structured in a way that is tax beneficial for both the parties. Tax avoidance is a crime, but structuring it a way that it benefits both the parties is not a crime at all. So you need to have advisors in place who will structure the deal in a way that will benefit both the parties from a taxation perspective. Another important aspect that we need to consider what is called as a withholding tax. Now, withholding tax particularly comes in when an Indian party is selling is buying from a foreign party, and money needs to go out to a foreign party. Now, in the Indian law, there are provisions that if it's going to a foreign party, you need to withhold certain amounts and tax and ensure that the tax payments are paid. So it is again very important to understand what are the withholding tax provisions, when are those applicable, how much withholding is holding back amount. So how much amount needs to be withheld. All of these factors also come into aspect in tax considerations. So tax considerations play a very, very, very important role when it comes to an acquisition transaction, and it is very important to have and understand and have advisors in place who will advise you appropriately with respect to the various tax considerations. So as we saw today, we saw part about how a target is identified, how a target should be identified, what is the criteria for identifying a target, when an acquisition takes place, how do you structure the nature of the acquisition, how do you structure the nature of the amount that is paid, and the tax consideration. Thank you for your time today. That's all.